It was a cold, moonless night when Robert Kalaniak set out on what should have been a routine drive. He had taken this route many times before, a winding stretch of road cutting through dense forest, but this night would be unlike any other. Robert had just finished a long shift at work and was eager to get home. The clock on his dashboard read 11:45 p.m. as he merged onto the desolate road. The only sound was the steady hum of his car's engine, the headlights cutting through the inky blackness ahead. About 15 minutes into his drive, Robert noticed something strange. The air seemed to grow colder, and an eerie mist began to form, clinging to the road like a shroud. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead. He slowed down, peering into the fog, trying to make out the road. As he rounded a particularly sharp bend, his headlights caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure standing by the side of the road. A woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her face obscured by long, dark hair. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. He sat there for a moment, trying to catch his breath and make sense of what he had just seen. Did someone need help? He thought. Against his better judgment, he decided to reverse and check if the woman was still there. Backing up slowly, he scanned the roadside, but the figure was gone. Robert's pulse raced as he wondered if he had imagined it. Just as he was about to dismiss it as a trick of the light, he heard a soft, mournful cry coming from the woods. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, he rolled down his window and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, just the haunting echo of his own voice. Determined to ensure no one was in danger, Robert grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The night was unnervingly quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under his feet as he approached the edge of the forest. The mist seemed to thicken around him, swallowing the beam of his flashlight. As he moved deeper into the woods, the crying grew louder, more desperate. He followed the sound, his breath visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, the crying stopped. The silence was deafening. Robert's heart thudded in his ears as he swept the flashlight in a wide arc, desperately searching for any sign of the woman. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Turning sharply, he was face to face with the woman from the roadside. Her eyes were hollow, lifeless, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Before he could react, she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. Terrified, Robert stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. He scrambled to his feet and ran back to his car, his only thought to escape. Fumbling with his keys, he managed to unlock the door and throw himself inside. As he sped away, Robert glanced in his rearview mirror. The woman stood in the middle of the road, her eerie figure growing smaller and smaller until it vanished into the fog. Shaking and drenched in cold sweat, Robert drove straight home, not daring to look back. He never took that road again, haunted by the memory of that night and the chilling figure that appeared from the mist. Before we dive into this bone-chilling tale, I must warn you, what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. If you dare, hit that subscribe button and join our haunted family. But beware, for once you enter, there's no turning back. Darkness awaits. It was a late autumn night, the kind where the chill in the air seeps into your bones, when Arthur Machen set out on a drive he would never forget. The road was one he knew well, winding through the dense forest that separated his hometown from the city. Little did he know, this familiar route would become the setting for a nightmarish encounter. Arthur had left the city later than planned after a long dinner with friends. The clock on his dashboard read 12:30 a.m. as he turned onto the deserted country road. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, casting the world in an oppressive darkness. He drove in silence, the only sound the steady drone of his car's engine. The trees loomed tall and menacing on either side, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to ensnare him. Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine, but he shook it off as fatigue. About 20 minutes into his drive, something strange happened. The temperature inside the car dropped suddenly, his breath fogging up the windshield. He turned up the heater, but it seemed to have no effect. Confused, he glanced at the thermostat. It read a normal temperature. Unease began to creep in. Then, he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just a few feet from the person. Heart pounding, he peered through the windshield. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and eyes hollow. Arthur rolled down his window and called out, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The man did not respond, simply staring at Arthur with a vacant expression. The silence was unnerving. Unsure of what to do, Arthur decided to get out and see if the man needed assistance. As he stepped out of the car, the cold hit him like a wall. He walked cautiously towards the figure, but as he approached, the man turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the woods. "Hey, wait!" Arthur shouted, but the man didn't stop. Against his better judgment, Arthur followed him into the forest, the darkness swallowing him whole. The air grew colder with each step, and an eerie mist began to rise from the ground. He called out again, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the mist. The trees around him were twisted and gnarled, casting grotesque shadows in the dim light of his flashlight. Suddenly, he heard a whisper, so faint he could barely make it out. It was calling his name. Panic set in as Arthur realized he was not alone. He swung his flashlight wildly, searching for the source of the voice. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Turning sharply, he found himself face to face with the man again. But this time, the man's face was twisted into a sinister grin. Arthur stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. The man loomed over him, his eyes now glowing with a malevolent light. Arthur scrambled to his feet and ran, the man's laughter echoing through the trees, chilling him to the core. He burst out of the forest and sprinted back to his car, his heart hammering in his chest. As he fumbled with the keys, he heard the whispers growing louder, more insistent. He finally managed to unlock the door, threw himself inside, and sped off, the tires screeching on the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, he saw the man standing at the edge of the forest, his eyes following the car until it disappeared around a bend. Arthur didn't stop driving until he reached his home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He never took that road again, the memory of that night haunting him. Arthur shared his terrifying experience with his YouTube family, hoping his story would serve as a warning to others. To this day, he wonders who or what he encountered on that desolate road and why it seemed to know his name. This chilling tale remains a mystery, a reminder that some roads are best left untraveled after dark. It was a late December evening when Peter Straub decided to take a shortcut through the countryside to get home. The road was one he had driven many times before, a narrow path winding through thick woods. But that night, something felt off from the very beginning. The clock on his dashboard showed 11:45 p.m. as he turned onto the secluded road. Snow had begun to fall lightly, blanketing the ground in a layer of white. The headlights of his car cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling flakes and casting eerie shadows among the trees. Peter drove in silence, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath his tires. As he rounded a bend, his car's radio crackled to life, playing a faint, static-filled melody. He glanced at the radio, confused, as he hadn't turned it on. He reached to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. Unease settled over him, but he continued driving, the strange music playing softly in the background. A few miles down the road, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road was a young girl, dressed in a thin, white nightgown, her bare feet stark against the snow. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from her. Peter's heart pounded as he stared at the girl. She didn't move and didn't react to the car's sudden stop. She just stood there, looking directly at him with wide, hollow eyes. Peter rolled down his window and called out, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The girl remained silent, her gaze unblinking. The radio continued to play its eerie tune, adding to the surreal atmosphere. Concerned for her safety, Peter got out of the car and approached her slowly. "Where are your parents? Do you live nearby?" he asked, but the girl still didn't respond. She simply turned and began to walk towards the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Without thinking, Peter followed her, the cold biting through his jacket. "Wait! You can't go in there alone!" he shouted, but the girl was already gone. The snow muffled his footsteps as he ventured deeper into the woods, his flashlight casting long, menacing shadows. He called out again, but only silence answered. The further he walked, the more disoriented he became. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab him. He could no longer see the road or his car. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a dense fog rolled in, obscuring his vision. The haunting melody from the car radio seemed to follow him, growing louder and more distorted. Panic set in as Peter realized he was hopelessly lost. Then, he heard it. A soft giggle, almost playful, coming from somewhere in the mist. He turned towards the sound, and there she was, standing just a few feet away, her face partially obscured by the fog. But something was different. Her eyes, once hollow, now glowed with a malevolent light. Peter's breath caught in his throat as she began to move towards him, her steps slow and deliberate. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. As he scrambled to his feet, the girl let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees, chilling him to the bone. Terrified, Peter turned and ran, the fog closing in around him. He had no idea where he was going, but he had to get away. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but he didn't stop until he burst out of the woods and onto the road. His car was just a few yards away. He sprinted to it, fumbled with the keys, and finally managed to unlock the door. He threw himself inside and slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he started the engine. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The girl stood at the edge of the forest, watching him with those glowing eyes, until she was swallowed by the darkness. Peter drove straight home, not daring to look back. He shared his terrifying experience with his YouTube family, hoping his story would serve as a warning to others. To this day, he wonders about the true nature of the girl he encountered that night and the eerie melody that still haunts his dreams. It was a cold, crisp winter night when M.R. James embarked on a journey that would forever be etched in his memory. The clock on his dashboard read 10:30 p.m. as he set out on the desolate country road, one that he had traveled many times before without incident. However, this night would prove to be different. The road wound through a dense forest, the trees standing tall and bare, their branches like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. A light dusting of snow covered the ground, and the air was filled with an eerie stillness. As he drove, the only sound was the soft crunch of tires on the snowy road. About 30 minutes into his drive, James noticed something unusual. The temperature inside the car began to drop rapidly, and his breath became visible in the air. He turned up the heater, but it seemed to have no effect. A sense of unease settled over him as he glanced at the thermometer. It read a chilling 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, out of nowhere, his headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing, his face pale and his eyes hollow. James hit the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just feet from the figure. Heart pounding, James rolled down his window and called out, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The man did not respond. He simply stood there, staring blankly at James. The silence was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the car's engine. Feeling a growing sense of dread, James decided to step out and check on the man. As he approached, he realized that the man's clothes were tattered and covered in dirt, as if he had been wandering for a long time. "Do you need a ride?" James asked, but the man remained silent. Suddenly, the man turned and began to walk towards the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Against his better judgment, James decided to follow him. The forest was eerily quiet, and the snow muffled his footsteps as he ventured deeper into the woods. "Wait!" James called out, but the man did not stop. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and a thick fog began to form, obscuring his vision. James could barely see a few feet ahead of him, but he pressed on, driven by a strange compulsion to understand what was happening. Then the man stopped and turned to face him. His eyes, once hollow, now glowed with a ghostly light. He raised a bony finger and pointed to a clearing just ahead. James's blood ran cold as he saw what lay there. A dilapidated, abandoned house, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. The man's voice, a hollow whisper, broke the silence. "This is where it happened," he said. "This is where they left me." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Who left you?" he asked. But the man did not answer. Instead, he began to fade, his form becoming transparent until he vanished entirely. Terrified, James turned and ran back to his car. The fog seemed to close in around him, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels. He stumbled out of the woods and into the road, gasping for breath. As he reached his car, he heard a faint, mournful wail echoing through the night. He jumped into the car and sped away, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the man standing at the edge of the forest, his glowing eyes following the car until it disappeared around a bend. James drove straight home, his mind racing with questions. He shared his terrifying experience with his YouTube family, hoping that his story would serve as a warning to others. To this day, he is haunted by the memory of that night and the ghostly figure who led him to the abandoned house. This chilling tale remains a mystery, a reminder that some encounters on lonely roads are best left unexplored, and some spirits are never truly at rest.